All right, this is our second video for our lifespan development course, and I am committed to recording a very much shorter video. So let me get started. Here we're going to talk about what is development and what is the lifespan perspective, and really just orient you to a few of the core ideas. And while we talk about this, we're going to also talk about why it's so cool. It's really cool. So let's just move ahead. And just to give you a sense of, well, what are we looking at when we're talking about development, is we're really asking ourselves this question: how do we become who we are and who we are going to be? And by we, I mean us individually. I mean we as human beings. I mean we as a particular culture. I mean we as women or we as men. But essentially, we're asking questions about how things move from one way to being another way. That's development. It's lasting change. And one of the key things about development that is really awesome is that it factors in time. You can't study development without studying things changing over time. And if you think about it, there's not a whole heck of a lot of other sciences that are as dependent on time for the very essence of what is being studied. Like if you did social psychology, you'd be interested in how do things happen in a group. Or if you did clinical psychology, maybe that's always a little bit developmental, but in clinical psychology, when somebody shows up to a psychologist's office and says, I have this problem, the focus is on, let's fix the problem. It might also be on, how did you get that way? So developmental insights are used in that setting. But developmental psychology assumes that there was something before, there's something now, and then something will come after. So it's really cool. Development, let's just look at this definition that is accepted by most developmentalists, and it's what we read about in our book. Development is the pattern of change that begins at conception and continues through the human lifespan. It includes both growth and decline. And one of the things that's interesting about this definition is this particular definition is not inherently psychological, because it is seen that development is so multifaceted that it needs to have a multidisciplinary approach to really understanding how a human being becomes the human being that it is. And but I wanted to sort of also put this into a sort of a more psychological perspective. So I'm proposing another way to think about it, because some of you either have or maybe you will take Psych 101. And one of the things that we learn in Psych 101 is that psychology is the scientific study of mental processes and behavior. And so then by extension, developmental psychology is the scientific study of lasting changes in mental processes and behavior over time. So again, there's this idea of the time playing the huge part in why this would be, oh, I forgot to put the timer on. Start. Why time is so important in studying development. It's also, we're not studying random change. We're not studying temporary change. We're actually studying how the organism, the human, the entity changes in a fundamental way as time passes. So I wanted to sort of orient you to how I think about development. This isn't something you're going to find in the book, but development in the book's definition, it starts at conception and moves through all the way to death, really. And that's lifespan development. But to really understand human development, I like to go way further back to the idea of our human species evolving. And so my picture, my understanding of why we are the way we are actually starts there. Because somewhere long ago, there was a creature that was eventually going to become us. And that creature and its offspring were living in an environment that required it to adapt. And as it adapted, it was responding to environmental pressures. And those environmental pressures actually made changes to our bodies. And one of the things that humans evolved to be good at is we evolved to be good at working together. In fact, that's our secret sauce, that we actually need other people just to survive. We don't hatch out of an egg and run around and instinctually eat food. We actually need other people. We need to be cared for other people when we're born, and we feel utterly lost and alone if we're excluded from other people as we grow. So this body needs other people. And the other thing about our body is the actual brain that we have is a physiological phenomenon. The hugeness of our brain, the ability of our brain to process incredible amounts of information and identify so many different types of patterns, that is something that has evolved as a survival mechanism to help us solve the problems in our environment. So instead of just evolving a different appetite, which makes us eat a certain plant, which then, we're dependent on that plant, we evolved the ability to farm, which is a collaborative thing. So this collaborative problem solving, which is actually a part of our bodies, it's a function of how our bodies evolved, it has led to us also forming beliefs and practices that solve environmental problems. So, for example, we know we really like that type of wheat, and it helps us to survive because guess what? We can store it over the winter, and we can cook. We can have something to eat in the middle of the winter when it's snowing. That's the type of thing where we're solving problems in our environment using our collaborative problem solving, and in doing so, we learn when to plant the seed in the springtime, when to make sure there's water on the seed. We basically learn the elements of safe farming and then there are other cultural things that evolve and develop too. We learn how to work together to defeat other tribes, which is another aspect of humanity. We learn how to divide up roles and where we divide the labor, and some parts of our group will do this type of work and other parts will do that type of work. So now we have this thing that we call culture, which are all the beliefs and rules and practices that help a group of people survive in a given climate. And this is how we know, for example, here's another example of how the climate is impacted. A culture that is evolved in Alaska teaches people, the cultural memory teaches people how to build an igloo, what to do to hunt a seal, when the snow looks dangerous and the ice might be thin. All of those things are culturally delivered to the new members of of that group. If you took somebody from Hawaii and you drop them into Alaska, they're not going to know any of that stuff. Similarly, the people from Alaska dropped into Hawaii, won't know how to get out past the breakers of the waves because they probably don't understand big waves. So it's these, and all of those environmental demands, right? It shapes our mind. So our mind, how we think, is actually shaped by the demands of the body. We demand food, so we're going to act a certain way when we're hungry, and water, and shelter, and sex, and community. So our mind is responding to these basic needs. It's also in being shaped by the culture itself. So we have bodily needs, we have cultural needs. We need to conform so that we're not rejected from the community. And now we know how to behave when it snows, and we know what type of roof to build, or whether to talk loudly or softly in a given situation. Like, we don't want to scare away the buffalo, that kind of thing. So the other thing that's really important to understand about our minds is that we are free to investigate the shaping of our minds. So there's all of this stuff that sort of we've inherited. We've inherited a sort of physical mind response, and we've inherited cultural rules and cultural beliefs that we learned from the very early ages, and we'll talk about that. But we also have a mind that is free, that we can investigate the very operations. We can study the processes by which the mind works. Even just having these bullet points here is evidence that I am not only constrained by the demands of the body and the culture, but I'm also free to observe patterns and identify different solutions and solve the problems of my life anew. And that's also a big part of development, that the individual gets to make choices. So what you see here is that the environment gave rise to the species, which gave rise to the bodies that we live in. The bodies now interacting with the environment gives rise to the culture, and now we have our minds. So we're studying in psychology and developmental psychology the interplay between our mental processes and our behaviors, and we're studying it in a scientific way. And so I wanted you to get this as a basic foundation, because this is how I understand our species has gotten to where it is such that we can even ask these questions. So hopefully, by the time that you are done with this course, you will have a sense that you are, and every human is, located in history, in culture, in a family, and in a body. And all of these processes have influence on our development. So, and so I this is just one little slide, right? But I love this slide. It says something very deep to me, and maybe that's because I'm 50-something and I've actually grappled with each one of these things, and I really sought to understand how they impacted my development. So that leads to my goal for you, is that you begin to understand how each one of these things has impacted your development, your parents' development, your future children's development. So now I'm moving on to one of the key issues in development, one of these, sometimes they're called the great debates. And in this one, we're looking at the debate between stages versus gradual continuous change. And what we're looking at here is an image of discontinuity. So discontinuity is another way of thinking about stages, where change is abrupt, and distinct stages of life are characterized by an abrupt onset of new capacity. So first, you're an infant. You're eating, drinking, grasping, rolling. There are all of these sort of developmental milestones that we even call them milestones, and tasks that we have to learn. And then as we enter into childhood, now we're sort of focused on the rules of our culture, the rules of our society, the goals, the strategies, the abilities, the predictions, the excitements, the disappointments, the good, the bad, the play. Childhood. Adolescence, it comes into a big time social self-consciousness. Now you're rational, you're idealistic, you're self-expressive. There's now, here as childhood, you're learning what the rules of society are. In adolescence, you're learning you're a person in that society, and you're actually learning to navigate between the who you are, the things that you want to do, your autonomy, your resistance of authority. You're also dealing with physiological changes like sleep disturbances. You're crazy drawn toward your peers, and you may be even in the middle of finding your purpose. Adulthood is largely about accepting responsibility for self and others and managing the household and accomplishing your life goals. You also have to suffer disruptions. Some of us will become parents. You're keeping all of these balls in the air while you're caring for your parents. You're also starting to experience health problems in ways that you didn't when you were younger. So there's adulthood, and old age is often characterized by satisfaction versus regret. Are you happy with the life you've lived? As you start to look back, you're also less interested in new things and more just comfortable with the familiar routines and habits. And now you have grown children and grandchildren, maybe declining health and declining energy. You're pursuing passions, and you start to think about leaving a legacy and the degree to which you did or want to still make a difference. You're really becoming dependent on others in ways that you didn't used to be. Used to be you who took care of everything. And now you're also having to contemplate death because it's coming, and it comes for us all. So, like in the stages, in the discontinuity perspective, all of these are distinct phases. You're an infant, boom. Then you're a child, boom. Then you're an adolescent, et cetera, et cetera. And there's this idea that you enter into these stages. Now, I wanted to also give you, here I go. I'm going to give you a little Shakespeare. Let me see how I'm doing on time. Boy, I'm going to read this to you, even though I'm late on time. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women are merely players. They have their exits and entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his act being 7 ages. So this is where the stages come in. At first, the infant, mewling and puking in the nurse's arms. Then the whining schoolboy with his satchel and shining morning face, creeping like a snail, unwilling to school. Then the lover, sighing like a furnace, with a woeful ballad made to his mistress's eyebrow. Then a soldier full of strange oaths, bearded like the pard, jealous of honor, sudden and quick in quarrel, seeking the bubble reputation even in the cannon's mouth. And then the justice, in fair round belly, with good cape and lined, with eyes severe, and a beard of formal cut, full of wise saws and modern instances, and so he plays his part. The 6th age shifts into a lean and slippered pantaloon, with spectacles on nose and a pouch on side, his useful hosed well saved, a world too wide for his shrunk shank. And his big manly voice turned again toward childish treble. Pipes and whistles is his sound. Last scene of all, that ends this strange eventful history, is the second childishness, the mere oblivion, sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. So maybe you don't get all of that, but essentially, let me tell you, he says here's a kid that's crying in the mother's arms, and the little boy is excited for life but doesn't want to go to school, and then the lover who's just over the moon about his true love, and then the the soldier who's quick to fight, and then the justice who's old and seemingly wise, but a little bit full of himself, and then the pantaloon guy, where his this is interesting, his youthful hose, which is basically the socks that they used to wear, because in the olden days they used to love men's calves for some reason. He's saved them and he wears them, but now this old guy has shrunk shanks. That means his calves are really small and unattractive. And then lastly, his voice has turned into a childish little voice, whistles and pipes in his sounds, and he enters then oblivion, and he doesn't have teeth, and he doesn't have eyes, he doesn't have taste, and he doesn't have anything. So this is a very well-known Shakespeare speech, and I wanted to share it with you because it's such a big foundational part of our culture, and also it's a foundational idea about how human beings move through stages in life. But that's not the only perspective. Another perspective is the stages versus gradual change. In looking at that is the idea that it's continuous. So the idea of continuity is that change happens gradually, with one advancement blending into another with no distinct phases. So this is my attempt to show you, oh, this is all just blending into another thing. And the thing that you do here, there's no real dividing line. It's not like it goes up a step, but suddenly you're in this, you can call it childhood, but how you got here was gradual. Another issue in developmental psychology is stability versus change. And so in this one, it's asking the question of what stays the same, that's stability, and what changes. And then I think what is super interesting in development is how does what stays the same interact with what changes. So here I was thinking about, well, what might be a good illustration of this? And here we've got Rosa Parks at a couple key points in her life. And when she was young, she was shy. But she was also found a lot of courage to do the thing that she did in sitting on the bus. And it may be that, her shyness, which might be something that she had her whole life, interacted with the courage that she developed when she decided she was going to fight for justice. Maybe that's what interacted with each other to make her someone who changed the world. And so this also is something that we can use to think about when we look at the nature versus nurture debate. So nature, that's sort of the genetic inheritance. Like, what is it that you physiologically inherited? Versus nurture, which is the environment that you grow up in, things that you learn or experience. And that experience then shapes who you are. And so in this debate, like an example of something that might be nature or derived from nature is that shyness is involved with a different pattern of brain activity. That there may be something, that it's not just some choice. You don't choose to be shy, but you may be actually more sensitive to negative stimuli than somebody who isn't shy. And that's what that brain activity indicates. When the right frontal brain activity is more active, then you actually researchers have found that indicates that you're more sensitive to negative stimuli, and so you want to avoid it more if it is more if it's a bigger experience for you than somebody who can sort of let it roll off their back. But an example of how nurture might be important is just the finding that moral courage, whether or not somebody speaks up against injustice, is actually associated with supportive, responsive parenting when compared to neglectful or dismissive parenting. And so what we see is that how somebody is raised can change the likelihood of whether they would behave in a morally courageous way. And that would be an example of nurture. And what I would do if I had thought about it, I would do a big fat, this one, pretty much no one thinks it's one or the other. Certain perspectives are interested in nature perhaps more than nurture, or nurture more than nature, but pretty much everyone agrees that it's nature and nurture interacting with each other. That nobody is born a complete blank slate. We're born with propensities or proclivities, or even, and some of those might be based in emotion, and nor is anyone born completely destined to be one thing or another. And so the other thing I want you to think about is sociocultural context. You know, here's culture, gender, socioeconomic status, ethnicity. And as we move into studying development in more detail, you will see that developmental science has to break things down into these measurable variables to begin to understand what impacts what. So these are sort of key variables that you'll see us looking at again and again. And as I round out the end of this presentation, I want to just let you think about the fact that, boy, nothing in life is not developmental. There's nothing that we know of in this world that wasn't one way. Something happened and it changed to be another way. And it's highly likely that it's going to be different if time continues, as we expect it will. So the last thought I want to leave you with is that hope is made possible by a developmental perspective. If nothing ever changed, there would be no hope. But if what you're interested in is in becoming a better person, or making the world a better place, or helping other people be all that they can be, a developmental perspective of understanding how people change over time can help you have hope as you pursue those types of goals. And that